Okay, so we've talked a lot about if-then statements. Now we're going to talk about what we call related conditional statements. Okay? Related conditional statements are the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. So as we look at these here, the conditional, okay, the whole key to a lot of this is being able to identify hypothesis and conclusion. If you can identify hypothesis and conclusion first, these will actually be pretty simple to take care of and write. So, very first part here, the conditional. Again, you're using the given hypothesis and conclusion. Remember, the hypothesis is the part that follows the word if. The conclusion is the part that follows the word then. So here is an example of a conditional. If the measure of angle A is 15, then angle A is acute. Okay? These are the symbols for it. If P, then Q. Okay? And that's how you read it. Now, the converse says that we're going to exchange the hypothesis and the conclusion. So the hypothesis, remember, the hypothesis is the part here that's in red. The hypothesis is this. The conclusion is that the angle is acute. They're going to switch places. So to find the converse, I'm going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if angle A is acute, then the measure of angle A is 15 degrees. Okay, over here it says if P or if Q then P. You'll notice these two switch spots. Okay, if Q then P. So the converse, to find the converse, you just simply switch the conclusion and the hypothesis. Now the inverse. The inverse means to negate. Now remember, this means negative, or essentially a lot of times you're putting in the word not. Okay, so to negate something, you're going to negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion of the conditional. So the inverse is going to look a lot like the conditional, except for the word not's going to be included. And if you look here at the inverse, if the measure of angle A does not equal 15, okay, that's what that we're adding the word not, then angle A is not acute. Okay, so the inverse is the negation of the conditional. Okay, so the little squiggly line right here, single squiggly line, means if not P, then not Q. Okay, if not P, then not Q. Then we have the contrapositive. The contrapositive is the negation of the converse. So we're going to negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion of the converse. So you'll notice here, if I were to do this, let's see here, these two, the converse, are very similar to each other. Converse and contrapositive. They're negations of each other. Then the conditional and the inverse are negations of each other. They look exactly the same, except one is negative. So in this case, I look back here, the converse, this is if angle A is acute, then the measure of angle A is 15. The contrapositive is going to say if angle A is not acute, then the measure of angle A is not 15. Okay? If not Q, then not P. Okay, so they're going to ask you to write these, and then they're going to ask you, are they true or false? Okay? So if you go back and look at these statements here, the original conditional statement, it says, if the measure of angle A is 15, then angle A is acute. Well, if A is 15 degrees, then that's an acute angle. That is true. Okay? The converse says if angle A is acute, then the measure of angle A has to be 15 degrees. Well, that's not true, because it says it's acute. I could be 89. I could be 33. It could be whatever number I want to put that's less than 90. So that's false. The inverse. If the measure of angle A is not 15, then angle A is not an acute angle. Well, wait, if it's not 15, it could be 33. Wait, is 33 an acute angle? It sure is. Sorry, you're false as well. And then the contrapositive. If angle A is not acute, then the measure of angle A cannot be 15. Well, if it's not acute, it cannot be between 0 and 89 degrees. Okay? And so therefore that's true. The conclusion. Okay, so let's look at some examples here now. It says, what are the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the conditional? And then if the statement is true or false, if the statement is false, make sure we give a counterexample. Okay, so here's your original if-then statement. Okay, if the figure is a square, then the figure is a quadrilateral. Now, I know that some of these words you do not have. I know some of these vocabulary words we have not necessarily been through yet, but I'll kind of explain them. Remember, I know you should know what a square is. A square is a four-sided figure that has all the same length. A quadrilateral is just a general four-sided figure. Okay, so if a figure is a square, then the figure is a quadrilateral. That statement, by the way, that's the conditional if-then statement. That is true. Okay, so we want to figure out what's the hypothesis and what's the conclusion. Well, again, this part right here, that's the hypothesis, and okay, so we've got hypothesis and we have conclusion. Those are going to be the keys because remember, we're going to, like for the converse, for example, we're going to switch those two. So instead of saying if the figure is a square, then the figure is a quadrilateral, we're going to switch. The converse is going to go first, the hypothesis is going to go second. So if the figure is a quadrilateral, then it is a square. Okay, so wait, we got to figure out, is that true or false? So if it's a quadrilateral, that means it's a four-sided figure. If it's a four-sided figure, does it have to be a square? No, it does not. So this guy right here is false because it could be a rectangle and still be a quadrilateral. Okay? All right, so now let's take a look now at the inverse. If you remember, the inverse and the conditional are the same statements, except the inverse is the negation of it. So you'll notice here, as I relate these two, if the figure is not a square, then it is not a quadrilateral. Okay? If the figure is not a square, then it's not a quadrilateral. Again, same as the conditional. Okay, same as the conditional. It's just the negated. I've added in the word not. Now, is this true or false? If the figure is not a square, then it's not a quadrilateral. This is also false because just because it's not a square doesn't mean that it cannot be a quadrilateral. It could be a rectangle, and it's still a quadrilateral, so that's false. Then the last one here, the contrapositive. Remember, the contrapositive is the converse negated. Okay, so it's this statement right here with not in it. So if the figure is not a quadrilateral, then it is not a square. Okay, if the figure is not a quadrilateral, that means it's not a four-sided figure. Then I know for sure it's not going to be a square. That statement is true. Okay, so next one. In this one, I'm not going to worry about the true statements. I'm just going to go through and show you how to write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive on this one. Okay, so in this case, here is your statement. If a vegetable is a carrot, then it contains beta-carotene. Okay, so this part right here is the hypothesis, and this part right here is the conclusion. I'm always going to identify that to help me write these. Okay, because again, the key to this is being able to identify hypothesis and conclusion. So the converse, remember the converse is the same as the conditional, except I'm going to switch my converse or my conclusion and my hypothesis. So if the vegetable contains beta-carotene, then it is a carrot. Okay, so I just simply switch these two. Okay, these two right here, they're going to switch spots. The inverse is the negation of the conditional. So it's going to be the same as a conditional, except it's going to have the word not in it. So if the vegetable is not a carrot, then it does not contain beta-carotene. And then the contrapositive and the converse are the same together. So the contrapositive and the converse are going to be the same. So in these two statements, they're going to be the same, except the contrapositive is going to have the word not in it. So if the vegetable does not contain beta-carotene, then it is not a carrot. Okay, so you should be able to write on page 3 now converses, inverses, and contrapositives and be able to tell me their truth values.